our second segment of this program, which is Prepare, we invite Tadzio, along with his panelists, Vice President of the World Bank, Mr. Jorge Familiar, CEO of the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Investment Facility, Mr. Isaac Anthony, representative of the St. Martin Detachment of the Netherlands Marines, Major Raymond Witteveen, and the Executive Director of the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, Mr. Ronald Jackson. Could have a seat. The climate is changing, and the Caribbean will be one of the zones in this planet to first feel the effects. Furthermore, the Caribbean region is prone to multiple potential natural disasters that can severely disrupt daily life. In the segment titled Prepare, the objective is to dissect the topic of preparation to reveal a more attainable concept. From the array of perspectives, it is clear that preparation means different things to different people. And this segment should not only highlight this, but also help to establish a deeper understanding of what it means to be prepared. Jorge Familiar, a Mexican national, has served as Vice President of the World Bank for Latin America and the Caribbean since 2014, and is the first Latin American to hold the position in the last 30 years.
Thank you.
Well deserved. In his current position, Mr. Familiar leads relations with 31 Latin American and Caribbean countries through a portfolio of ongoing projects, technical assistance and grants worth more than $31 billion US. Traditionally, the region has delivered around 30% of the bank's annual lending commitments. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for the Vice Director, Mr. Jorge Familiar.
Thank you so much, Prime Minister, Governor, Prime Ministers, dignitaries, ladies and gentlemen. It is a real honor for me to be here with you today. Let me start with a small clarification. I'm the Vice President for the Caribbean and Latin America, not for Latin America and the Caribbean. I am Latin American. I hope that you consider me Caribbean at heart, because we have been devoting significant efforts, resources, and attention to the challenges facing small island states of the Caribbean. And we do so because we are convinced that they face a peculiar set of challenges which are very significant and that can only be overcome with the support and collective work of all stakeholders. This means, of course, governments. This means, of course, the private sector. This means, of course, civil society. But multilateral institutions, development partners, regional institutions also play a very important role. And we need to work closely together, and we need to work well coordinated because the challenges are quite significant. You know, last year was a huge wake-up call, and I think that you know it much better than I do. No? We were in the UN discussing how to support countries affected by Irma, and as we were going into conference, you know, we had Maria turning from a tropical storm into a Category 5 hurricane in a matter of hours and hitting again countries. No? In fact, we had a World Bank team, you know, flying and landing into Dominique as the storm was approaching. No? And then when we were reviewing why this happened, well, it happened because it was one of the fastest, you know, turning storms in history. No? So what can we expect going forward? We can expect more of this. So this goes to the heart of what we're going to discuss now. No? We need to be prepared. And what does being prepared mean? I think it means a lot of things. I think we need to have a 360-degree view of preparedness. It means good communication and good understanding. People need to know what these natural events can do and can cause, and how to behave and how to conduct oneself when these things happen. This is fundamental. We need strong civil protection systems and mechanisms. We need shelters so that people can be well protected while the storm is hitting. We need resilience, and resilience is a broad topic. When we are recovering from a disaster, like it's happening today in many Caribbean nations, it's happening today in St. Martin, which, by the way, is an effort that the World Bank is very pleased and honored to be able to support, together supporting the government of St. Martin, supporting the government of the Netherlands for the benefit of the people of St. Martin in the recovery efforts. And these recovery efforts mean building back better, making sure that the critical infrastructure can sustain the kind of hazard that we are seeing and we will see in the future. And building back better also means that you cannot cut corners. Building back better is harder. It takes time. It generates a little bit of frustration, you see, because one would like to have infrastructure up and running right away. But resilient infrastructure takes time and needs to be well designed, well planned, well executed. It's not just infrastructure. It's also having the right financial instruments and the right fiscal policies. We cannot talk today about environmental resilience without talking about fiscal resilience. So countries will need to look at disaster risk management from a holistic point of view. There is a need to use available financial instruments to hedge against risks, and there has been a lot of innovation in this field. And let me tell you that the frontier has been moving precisely in the Caribbean, both from the perspective of the development of the instruments, but also from the perspective of the evolution of the thinking about disaster risk management. But an important complement to this is good fiscal management. So there's been lots of innovation. No? The Caribbean Risk Insurance Facility, I believe, is the most obvious example. It has become the first line of defense of Caribbean nations to face climate hazards. It's usually the quickest payout that arrives in a country. But then, you know, there are also contingent lines of credit, like catastrophe lines of credit with a drawdown option from institutions like the World Bank. There are also other measures like sovereign catastrophe funds or sovereign wealth funds. And here is where the dimension of fiscal resilience comes at play. And more recently, we have also supported countries in the issuance of catastrophe bonds, which are bonds in which catastrophe risks are transferred to the market. And this year we had a major breakthrough, a major innovation, the very first catastrophe bond for more than one country. It was done in Latin America. It was done with the Pacific Alliance countries. It provides insurance to Mexico, Peru, Chile, and Colombia against earthquakes. It's a bond issued by the World Bank, so it's risk-free, but it sells to interested investors the earthquake risks that the countries want to get rid of. So this is the kind of innovation that we are trying to put together. And there is another dimension, no? And the other dimension is also creating or preserving opportunities for jobs and growth. No? And here I believe that for the Caribbean, the blue economy and working together to preserve the natural assets that the region has is critical. And related to jobs, also, you know, it's not just the economy that gets affected when a hurricane hits. It is the most vulnerable of the population. So safety nets have a role to play. Social safety nets, which are adaptive, which can be increased and expanded when the need arises. This has to be part also of the preparation to face disasters. Here in St. Martin, the government has put in place a program that gives income support for people that are either out of work or underemployed because of the hurricanes. And at the same time, these people are getting training. I had a chance to visit this project yesterday, and let me tell you that it is impressive because it has a multiplying positive effect, because it not only helps people go through the bad times, it also helps them build their human capital, and this will generate more growth opportunities for them, for their families, and for the country. Let me leave it here. I think that I have gone on for way too long, and I'm sure that what you really want is to have a conversation with all of us. So thank you so much.
Considering the thematic of preparation, I would now like to invite Mr. Isaac Anthony from CRIF to give his remarks. Mr. Anthony, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Protocol having been established, I would still like to recognize the presence of the distinguished governor and the Honorable Prime Minister of St. Martin. I'm really pleased to be here, and I think, like many of you, I have lived through many natural disasters. I actually come from St. Lucia, and I remember having lived through Hurricane Allen in 1980. And then when I became a senior civil servant, I had to deal with Hurricane Thomas. And then we had to deal with a drought. And then we dealt with an earthquake. And then we dealt with severe rainfall events, at least 2 or 3 following. So we've really had to deal with a lot of these issues. But let me, before I really get into my keynote, let me say that to really express appreciation to the new members of CRIF. We have Montserrat. We also have the British Virgin Islands. And of course, last but not least, St. Martin. I would like to say the new kid on the block. I think you definitely made the right decision. I know that I was here a few years ago, and we did speak about the possibility, but it's never too late, and I'm glad you are now part of the CRIF. And I also like to acknowledge, obviously, the tremendous leadership that has been shown by St. Martin, and I'd like to urge you to continue. But let me begin by saying that the story of natural disasters and the impacts in the Caribbean is very well known. In the Caribbean and Central America, the frequency of hazards and disasters is increasing. And although mortality resulting from disasters seem to be decreasing, strangely enough, economic costs are rising precipitously. In fact, the Caribbean region is one of the most disaster-prone regions in the world. For example, between 1980 and 2015, Caribbean countries suffered from 390 documented, that is, natural disasters. Most of them tropical cyclones and hurricanes and floods. Similarly, another 366 natural disasters occurred in Central American region. According to the International Monetary Fund, natural disasters which can have a large negative impact on government finances and economic growth in affected countries are the second leading cause after the banking crisis of materialization of contingent liabilities for emerging market sovereigns and are sometimes the direct cause of sovereign default. According to Moody's, the average annual damage from natural disasters over 1980 to 2015 was 1.5% of GDP in emerging markets versus 0.3% of GDP in developing economies. The average share of affected populations over the same period was 3% in emerging markets versus 0.4% in developed economies. In fact, among the 20 most vulnerable countries globally, more than half represent small island states across the Caribbean and the Pacific region. These 20 countries bear average losses between 20.1% and 2.1% of their respective GDP every year. The countries in the Caribbean that are referenced here, particularly in this, would have been Belize, Jamaica, the Bahamas, St. Vincent and the Grenadines. But we know only too well the story of Haiti and, of course, Dominica and, as I said, St. Lucia. We are all too aware of how climate change is increasing both the frequency of events and the intensity of events. Take the example of Hurricane Irma in 2017. The Economist newspaper reported that damage in the Caribbean from Irma was a staggering $13 billion. In Dominica, Hurricane Maria resulted in total damages of $931 million and losses to the economy of $382 million, which amounts to 226% of GDP in 2016. The IMF noted that Dominica would face a protracted recovery with GDP projected to decline by 16% in 2018 before rebounding in 2019 as reconstruction gathers pace. Also, tourism in the region was dramatically impacted by the storms. The Caribbean Development Bank predicted that every 1% reduction in tourist arrivals will cost $137 million in losses. And of course, I'm referring to US dollars. The storms also affected the agricultural sector in Dominica, Antigua and Barbuda, and St. Kitts and Nevis, severely impacting farms, housing, irrigation, infrastructure, feeder roads, crops, and livestock, forest reserves, and coastal fisheries. It is clear that natural disasters, therefore, have a severe macroeconomic impact, including directly impacting a country's economic strength, government fiscal policy, or strength, that is, and external vulnerability, expressed through increasing debt to GDP ratio. And again, we know all too well the story about a number of countries in the Caribbean being among the most highly indebted countries in the world. And there's absolutely no question that, and studies have been done to illustrate this, that the severity and certainly the frequency of natural disasters is actually contributing to this. Of course, as we can say, left unchecked, the economic impact of natural disasters can generate large losses that disrupt long-term economic growth trajectories and, by extension, our pathways to sustainable development. So how do we prepare? And how are the proactive elements that we must include in preparations? We already know that the rising economic impact of natural disasters in the Caribbean can be attributed to growing concentration of assets and populations in areas at high risk of natural disasters. These impacts are likely to continue given expectations of further rapid urbanization, increasing environmental and ecosystem degradation, and an increase in the frequency and intensity of hazards, resulting from, of course, climate change. These are areas that we must begin to address as we prepare. Historically, and up to the last 10 to 12 years, when one focused on the thought of preparedness, the notion of disaster mitigation often came to mind. Building seawalls, improving building codes, etc. The question is mitigation enough? The short answer, of course, is no. While disaster mitigation is critical to the disaster preparedness of the equation, we must add risk transfer and risk financing, and like I said above, the potential psychological impact on people. There are many disaster risk mitigation strategies that countries are implementing. Of course, some of these would include mainstreaming climate change issues into sectoral policies, example, tourism, agriculture, at the national level and other decision-making processes. And this is very important, again, given the heavy reliance of many of our countries on tourism and agriculture. Number 2, adopting best practices for climate change adaptation. 3, creating and strengthening national platform for hazard risk reduction. 4, modernizing legal frameworks to address hazard risk reduction and vulnerability. 5, establishing measures to incorporate hazard risk reduction in land use practices and the development of human settlement. 6, implementing modern building codes. 7, putting in place the necessary infrastructure, such as seawalls to protect coastlines. And 8, conducting vulnerability impact assessments of communities and determining best practices and action to reduce future vulnerabilities. But the question is mitigation enough? In the face of changing climate, the answer is no. And as we seek to advance a more sustainable future, we must take into account risk transfer and financial protection. And at this point, I would like to share a little bit about the organization that I represent, called the CRIF. And it is perhaps one of the very good examples of a case where we united as a region to help address the issue of resilience from a disaster risk financing perspective. But before I do this, let me just give you a little more statistics to put things into context, because we're really dealing with the area of insurance. In developing countries, insurance and capital markets are widely used to hedge the immediate adverse impact of natural disasters. So according to Munich Re, more than 40% of the direct losses from natural disasters are insured in developing countries. 40%, and we're talking about developed countries. At the same time, that figure is 10% of losses for middle-income countries, and a woeful 5%, less than 5% for low-income countries. So now let me share a little bit about the CRIF story, but this really puts into context the huge problem of underinsurance, which is still very evident in the Caribbean, and which, again, CRIF is clearly working along with several regional organizations like CDIMA and the World Bank to address. Now, CRIF, which was formerly known as the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, was created as an immediate response to Hurricane Ivan. Many of you would recall Hurricane Ivan, which devastated Grenada and the Cayman Islands. And in those two countries, the losses were put at about 200% of GDP. But that single hurricane event for the entire Caribbean caused losses of $6 to $8 billion, really again exposing the magnitude of losses from one single event. And this, in a sense, was a wake-up call for the countries of the Caribbean, who felt really exposed, and the day after, literally the day after, called on the World Bank for assistance in setting up some sort of disaster risk financing mechanism. And so with the support of the donor community and other stakeholders, came to establish what is, as I said, was called the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, and has now been renamed CRIF SPC. So when we started, we had 16 members, and as you know, that number has now grown to 20 with the latest edition of St. Martin. And we started by providing what we call parametric insurance, which is a type of insurance that allows you to predetermine what the likely losses would be. And because of that predetermination, we are now in a position to be able to make payouts very quickly, which is the key value proposition of what we provide. Because when countries are faced with a disaster, they don't want to have to be waiting 6 months, a year to obtain resources. They want it now, immediately, and that's why CRIF was established. So we started off by providing parametric insurance for tropical cyclone, for earthquake, and more recently we have added excess rainfall. In fact, as I'm speaking, I'm now dealing with a live situation in Trinidad and Tobago, where I now have to make a payout to the government under the excess rainfall policy, which, by the way, they only purchased for the first time 2 years ago, and in 2 years they're receiving payouts. So it just shows you that the facility is working, thanks to the support of everybody, including the World Bank. But the question is, are we really achieving that mandate? And it is very clear that we're to be doing this. And since the establishment of CRIF in the year 2007, we've made payouts totaling $136.3 million, 37 payouts in all, to 13 member countries. In fact, for last year alone, CRIF paid out $62 million for the countries affected by Irma and Maria. And of course, including the $7 million that we would have paid to the government of Trinidad and Tobago for the excess rainfall event. So I think it is now established that the facility is working. But just one of the things that I really want to clarify, that CRIF was never intended to cover all the losses, the overwhelming loss of relating to natural disasters. The whole intention was to be able to provide quick liquidity. And a point that I always make is that a dollar received immediately after an event has far more utility than a dollar received a year after the event. I mean, I don't know if that makes sense to you, but that's essentially how it works. And I think we have a number of countries. We have Turks and Caicos here. Right. I see the premier of Turks and Caicos who would have received a number of payouts and can attest to what I'm just saying. So we clearly see that it is working. Now, one of the things that we are now embarking on is trying to scale up the facility, because we do have to deal with the huge issue of underinsurance. I mean, we had a case of, I don't mind if Dominica hopefully would not take an issue with that, but I use Dominica as an example. We're the most basic insurance policy coverage. Dominica was able to receive $20 million from CRIF in less than 14 days with the most basic coverage. So could you well imagine if, for example, Dominica had a lot more by way of coverage? And so one of the things that we are now doing is that we are working with our members to scale up or to increase coverage. And I am pleased to report that in the current policy year, a number of countries have actually taken steps to increase their coverage, and we are continuing to work with them in that regard. The other thing that we are doing is that we are now seeing the real potential for parametric insurance. So we're now adding to this. So we have actually just completed a drought model, and so a drought product will be made available. We're also doing agriculture. We also involving in fisheries. And so all these sectors will be covered. And of course, one of the things that we're also looking, in addition to increasing products, is that we're also looking to see how we could add new countries. So as I said, this is perhaps a very good example of what we mean by uniting, preparing, and adapting, where all the countries have really come together to be able to achieve something that really works for the region, and really put into focus what we really mean by being a resilient region. I thank you.
Thank you. So So thank you, Mr. Anthony, for your presentation. Also, thank you, Mr. Familiat, for your presentation earlier. I would now like to offer the opportunity to Mr. Witteveen and Mr. Jackson to give brief introductory remarks, and then after that, we'll go directly into the panel discussion. So, Mr. Witteveen.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning to you all. I would first like to thank the Prime Minister for inviting me for today. And I feel honored to be here as a panel member, although it's my first time as a panel member and I'm a little bit nervous because as a military I'm trained to go to war and not to go to a panel. So but thank you very much for having me here, and it also emphasizes the unity on St. Martin. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Major. Appreciate it.
Also, I'm sitting here today as a military commander, but I'm living and working on the island for almost 2 years now. So I'm also a resident on St. Martin. So I also have experienced the disaster Irma as a resident and as a military commander. For today, my goal during this panel will be the military perspective on the preparations. So for the military preparation means it all starts with a plan. We have almost a plan for everything. I think we also have a plan for group photos.
Should share it in terms of united.
After today, we can share it. Okay. But the other thing in planning military operations is worst case scenario. I think in our risk assessment process we always plan worst case scenario, because for the military it's easier to downscale than to upscale. And that is also a thing we've experienced here on St. Martin during Irma. The other thing as a military unit is self-sufficient. In our preparations and planning, one of the goals will be to be self-sufficient, at least for the first few days, because that is one of the important things on this side of the world where all islands can be isolated in just a few hours. And for us, it's a focus on core competencies, because we cannot do everything, and that also means for other entities or organizations, we all have to focus on core competencies. And for us as military organizations, rehearsals are also very important. For executing every military operations, we do rehearsals many times. And the thing I want to give back today is the challenge we all have is that we cannot do it alone as entity, organization or country, because there are a lot of entities and organizations involved in disaster management. And that is also the most important thing. We can all start planning, making plans, but all our plans have to stick to each other, so we can all execute the plans with one important goal. Thank you.
Thank you, Commander. Thank you very much. Mr. Jackson, your opening remarks.
Sure. I want to also extend my thanks and recognize the Excellency Governor and the Honorable Prime Minister and all of the distinguished delegates here, and certainly sitting in the room, really getting the perspectives, given that I represent an institution that really was born out of this intent around uniting, and so the perspectives on the challenges we're facing in regionalism is certainly something that is central to the institution that I head, which is really seeking to engage a united Caribbean towards addressing a comprehensive risk management agenda and building resilience, an agenda we've been engaged in since 2001. And so the perspectives I will give is really going to be looking at a much more comprehensive view. Mindful of time, I'm going to jump right in and just share and talk around 3 to 4 key slides. So when we talk about being resilient, we are looking at, you see there are six or seven bubbles. Those are the critical elements we are trying to achieve. And if we're taking it and looking at an expanded view of preparedness beyond simply plans, strategies, governance, but also looking at the challenges that the current environment presents and the future, an unknown future presents, then we have to begin to look beyond simply the humanitarian components. We have to look beyond simply the financial components, but also look at some of the things we have to do in the development side as we prepare for a future that is uncertain. Next slide. Next slide. Central to all of this has to be our focus on risk and vulnerability. In the current environment we operate, and you would have heard the feedback from Jorge, from Isaac, and others who have spoken about the fiscal issues. We are currently a region that has built up tremendous amount of exposure and increasing vulnerability to the point where if we're going to be preparing and to be effectively prepared, we have to drive down exposure and vulnerability. In our context in the Caribbean, it's that easy. Much of the region is exposed to climate-related hazards, to seismic hazards. We take an expanded view of risk, looking at all types of hazards, but the central theme is tackling exposure and vulnerability. If we don't do that, we're not going to be successful going forward in the future. The rate of the change in climate, the challenges we face in terms of development demands that we accelerate that pace. And so one of the things we've looked at SEDIMA, beyond the current strategy we're implementing, is to promote a resilience pathway that is focusing on 4 things. And you heard them coming out over the day. Social protection for the poor and most vulnerable. A lot of the information, the 2.1% to 20% average losses are reflected in impact on the poor, in the social sector, and on infrastructure. So we've looked at the whole issue of infrastructure safeguards. The environment, which is central to our economic prosperity, is also a priority. And of course, operational readiness for response and recovery has to be a part of any resilience agenda. Why? 1.5. 1.5 is more than 1. 1.5, though less than 2, is still too much because we're facing the challenges of a changing climate now. And no matter what we do in terms of our advocacy abroad, the climate isn't going to heal in the next 50 to 100 years. I see my friend Ken, he can speak to that. So response is going to be the order of the day. We won't change the level of exposure overnight. And so part of our whole idea around preparedness and transforming our thinking has to look at the broader resilience agenda that is represented here. Next slide, please. Before I leave you with a few questions, next slide, I want to just show we've applied what we call an audit assessment of the Caribbean countries that are under SEDIMA. And it shows that when we look at preparedness, which covers, next slide, which covers governance, regulations, policies, planning, community resilience, warning and alerts, financing for disaster risk management, not disaster risk financing, no, but the full suite of disaster risk management, the use of ICTs, and operational readiness. Our countries are low to moderate in their level of readiness. 75 to 86% of the countries are within low to moderate. And we're facing the challenges now. We have to work to address that. So some of the key questions I want to leave the panel with as we get into our conversation is, what is our short, medium, and long-term vision for preparedness? What does it look like? I showed some bubbles which gives you our own perspective of that. How can we forge a collective vision around preparedness, recognizing that in each state it may look differently? But then when we look at a region prepared, what are we looking for? How do we effectively finance and enable this vision beyond simply disaster risk financing? Because currently when we look at national budgets, the allocation for preparedness is low. Can we individually afford the cost of preparedness given our current levels of risk exposure, vulnerability, and indebtedness. It brings us back to the conversation around unite. Can we, as governments, are we truly committed to pooling capacity and resources for effective preparedness in the way we are approaching the very important agenda around pooling our resources for risk transfer? I want to leave us with those key questions as we move into the discussion sections from my perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jackson, for that excellent, excellent elucidation. And indeed, 1.5 to stay alive is the motto that we should keep ourselves. So in the interest of time, I know my belly is grumbling a little bit. I would like to invite the audience actually to pose their questions, whatever questions that you may have to our esteemed panel. So, any questions? Yes, right here.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you, Chief
I'd like
Minister.
to first of all, thank the St. Martin government for enabling this very important summit on an issue which certainly impacts all of us. The earlier presentations were excellent, and it pointed to issues outside of the burning issue of disasters that impact our islands. But in this session, the importance of financing the preparedness and the recovery are critical. I would like to commend CRIF for the job that they have been doing. Government of Angola joined CRIF back to 2008. We were one of the earliest persons who got involved in it. We've had 2 payouts over that period, maybe more. But certainly it has been critical for our early responses to issues affecting our region. That is a clear indication of what uniting to deal with these issues represents, and we've got to continue to grow that in other areas. Because when a hurricane or any disaster hits a small country or island, it hits a small country and island. It doesn't hit Texas, the United States. When it hits Texas, the rest of the United States can come to its aid. But we have got to look externally, or we got to unite to come up with programs that will assist us as individual islands when that comes around. So the question I'm asking, because of the scarce resources we have in budgets, and you pointed to it, Mr. Jackson, what can we do, or what are we doing, or what should we be doing to deal with that critical issue of preparedness? I mean, we can come up with all kinds of ideas of how we fund recovery, because at that time there are emotions involved. People are anxious to help, be getting assistance from all parts of the world, maybe in limited amounts, and sometimes it's not relevant to the situations that we face. But certainly, the issue of preparedness is what we need to focus a lot of attention on. We cannot prepare for hurricanes like Irma and Maria completely, but at least we can mitigate some of the impacts that they can have on our community. So what ideas are coming out of all of these discussions? And I expect that something like that should happen coming out of these meetings. And I'm glad that we have the World Bank here. I'm glad that my friend Jolita is here, because she has been very, very helpful to us in all different ways, not only in this issue. So we have your attention. Can you, we'd like to talk around these times about leadership and what the leadership is doing, but it's the entire community. It's not about leadership alone. Leadership is important, but not only political leadership.
Absolutely.
Leadership within the community is critical. So what are we doing that is coming outside of the region, that is coming within the region, to respond to those issues of preparedness.
Thank you, Chief Minister Banks. Panel?
Going first.
Mr. Jackson.
Well, I'm going to go first. I'm not going first because I necessarily have all the answers, but I think one of the things we need to walk away from this discussion, and we have, the bank, we have CRIF here, is how can we find a similar mechanism that can allow us to be able to find, because the challenge we're having is financing that particular element of preparedness. But it's on several levels. As I pointed out in my presentation, we don't want to be taking good resources and chasing after the bad. And at the moment, the level of vulnerability and exposure is really too high. And so we won't, as states, be able to put in the level of preparedness to treat with the level of displacement and impact on the population we see now. So how do we then, as I've said, collectively set up a system, as we've seen in the context of, and it may be a challenge for Isaac and some of the others to look at what mechanism can be used to ensure that there is resources, because at the moment, as I've said before, risk transfer, we support that 150%, but it comes at the end. How do we ensure that we have resources that can establish appropriate shelters, that builds the confidence in the citizens that they can evacuate when you need them to evacuate, and that you can deal with the humanitarian needs within the first few hours and days? And that's where the big gap is. And I myself am now searching and engaging around models that we could use to finance that particular scenario, recognizing the current challenges, fiscal challenges that governments face. Jorge talked about fiscal instruments and their ability to hedge against risk. And one of the things you also mentioned was the importance of fiscal management. And I couldn't help but link that to, if we have solid fiscal management, if we're able to invest in the renewable energy side, are we able to unlock and release additional resources in our economy that can finance the broader humanitarian agenda? Because here we see a lot of our resources going into fossil fuels, or balance of payments, et cetera, et cetera. If we invest in the advantageous side of a changing climate, which is renewable energies, and we look at the whole circular economy, where we're creating savings from reusing, can that go into government's ability to finance their preparedness efforts? So those are some of the things that are emerging from our side as we go forward. We need partnership to join that conversation to find the solutions towards it. That's my initial stab at the question, Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Jackson. Mr. Familiar?
Thank you so much. And I would like to start with a couple of things that the Major mentioned. He mentioned that he was prepared to go to war and not to a panel. I am prepared to come to a panel. I would never be prepared to go to war. And the second thing is that I think that his contribution is at the core of what's needed. No, everything starts with a plan. So that's a concept I would like to work on a little bit. No, I think that for a long time we have approached the issue of disaster response sort of like a piecemeal approach, and not only disaster response but also disaster preparedness. And at times institutions like the World Bank are on the sell side of things, right? We know that a hurricane hits and CRIF is created, and then we sell CRIF, no? Because CRIF is available. No? So at times we are like, door-to-door salesmen, and we go and we say, well, we have the catastrophe bond here, we have the catastrophe line of credit there. I don't think that approach works. And I think that the thinking precisely in the Caribbean has moved the boundaries from a piecemeal approach to one that requires a plan. So that is why I mentioned that fiscal resilience needs to come together with the conversation around climate resilience. So it's fundamental to have our macroeconomic houses in order to build the fiscal space that allows a country to grow, to invest, and also to hedge. And then on the climate resilience part, there are at least two elements. No? One is preparedness, no? From a perspective of civil protection and monitoring and evaluation of climate events. But then there's insurance and investment in resilience. And coming up with an insurance safety net has cost implications. And there are trade-offs. Either you decide to put money into CRIF and a cat bond and another insurance product, or you build a stronger and more robust utility network for water and sanitation and for electricity. So there are trade-offs. So that is why this notion of the plan is fundamental. No? So I couldn't agree more that everything should start with a plan. The other element is the big challenge that small island states have is scale. And at times when we refer to scale, we say that there is no choice but to choose. I think that we should move from that to thinking there is no choice but to work together. Because when you consider a small island state in isolation, yes, the scale is small. When you consider the group of countries and when you consider not only the landmass but also the ocean, then you have scale. And then other partners need to come in and need to help and support the efforts. And that will be easier if the conversations around fiscal resilience and climate resilience come together.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Any other contributions?
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, certainly. I mean, I do agree, and I think it's a very important issue that you've raised. I think the real problem we have is exactly what you've said about the planning aspect. I think that's one of the issues. I don't think that enough, while many countries often recognize the value of what needs to be done immediately after a disaster. When the disaster goes, and for a few months or a year, the rhetoric is gone, and there is not enough effort in being done to tackle it in a holistic way. These disasters are major economic shocks, and as we have seen, and I think I made that point earlier, they're increasing in intensity and frequency. And we absolutely have to deal with it in the right way. Now, insurance is one aspect, but insurance by itself is not enough. I heard Ronald asking the point, how do we finance the immediate needs? In other words, the day after a disaster, or even before, when we know that a hurricane is approaching, certain things need to be put in place. How are these things going to be financed? And one of the things that I very often proposed, and I know that some countries already have this in place, you need to have a well-funded disaster fund, even if it's at the very minimal level, to be able to deal with those immediate needs. I know taxes is not a popular word. It has never been a popular word. But why? I mean, we have taxes for every conceivable thing. Yet still, perhaps we have not given enough consideration to saying, okay, let's use 1% or 0.5% of an environmental levy and make sure those resources go into a fund that we can build up over time. And that fund might potentially help you to fund not just your insurance premium, which, by the way, needs to be scaled up, but also to fund those immediate needs that Ronald is talking about. What I find happening very much in the region is that we often look to somebody to help us solve that problem. But we have to start solving that problem ourselves. I mean, I'm all aware of the discussion taking place at the UN and the climate change agencies, which I'm not saying they're not important, and there is not a role for that. But I am saying this is a problem that afflicts us as a region directly, and we have to take control of it and deal with it.
Indeed so.
Can I join?
Yes, definitely.
I really applaud Isaac's perspective on that, because again, in Irma Maria response, we saw the full, well, we didn't see the full power of the Caribbean united, but we saw the vision of the full power of a united Caribbean at work. In its ad hoc state, in its coordinated state, in its non-coordinated state. And so one of the things we've been pushing for is this very thing that we're talking about. How can we pool? How can we do it better? The issue of the taxes. I worked at the national level. Let me tell a story. You say telling stories is good. At the national level, we looked at our population, and we were able to look at the number of persons that could be displaced from a Category 4 or 3 storm. And we baseline that. And we look at what it meant to be prepared within the context of the resources we have. And we recognize we only had resources for 32,000 people. And we were looking at potentially 100 to 150,000. We had a national disaster fund, anemic at best. So those things are important, but the problem is, again, as I said, there's no commitment to growing those pieces that we're talking about. And that's what we need to fix. Now, you raise taxes. As regional organizations, we put on the table to our heads of government at the time, 1% levy on airfare, tourist airfare. What is tourism? Tourism is what? Is the people. It's the place we sell. So if our people are resilient, they are able to offer the product. And so we're saying, look at this as a means of both financing your obligation to regional organizations within the human security architecture, but also financing some of your national level obligations to safety and security at stateside. Some countries implemented it, some didn't. So the avenues are there, but we have to be bold, we have to be courageous, we have to show leadership, as we've said, St. Martin, and implement these measures that can allow us to meet those particular obligations, sometimes to a lesser impact on the society and the population. So, Isaac, I thank you for bringing that particular point out, because it's certainly something that I've lived, and I see where we can deliver more in that particular area.
Thank you. I think we have room for just one more question from the audience.
Good morning. Anya Williams, Deputy Governor and Territory Authorizing Officer for Turks and Caicos. I want to join first of my colleagues in thanking the Prime Minister and Governor of St. Martin for hosting this very timely and relevant summit, and also to extend our thanks to CRIF for the assistance that they've offered to Turks and Caicos throughout the years. I believe that Turks and Caicos and Anguilla should now be receiving a discount from CRIF as a part of your Friends referral program, because we spoke so positively on our experiences with CRIF in Brussels probably just 2 years ago that I believe we were instrumental in helping other countries to see the importance of joining CRIF. And so we've certainly seen the benefit of being a part of CRIF, because countries and economies like ours that benefit heavily from tourism, that rely heavily on tourism, we know that should a hurricane pass and hotels are closed, airports are closed, that first flow of cash flow is important to help you do small things, even if it's simple as paying your staff so that they can begin to recover or to put money back into the economy. But touching on the whole issue of preparedness, I believe that we all as OCTs have to realize that we are only as prepared as our people, and that oftentimes we focus heavily on governments preparing itself, and we focus on recovery in terms of government programs and so on. And that's actually the easier aspect, because government can, in most cases, reprioritize its finances, its budgets. We can repair buildings and schools and so on. But developing social programs to assist citizens in being able to prepare and recover, I believe, is the hardest element. I believe that is the area that we also have to pay some focus to in terms of developing social programs. We are lucky as a region that this year there were no storms that impacted us, but had that been the case, our biggest concern would have been how do we protect our citizens that have still not been able to recover from the storms of last year. One of the challenges that many OCTs faced was not only persons that did not have insurance, but those that did have insurance, helping them to deal with the hurdles of accessing those insurance monies and being able to deploy them. So the question for us is, how do we also not prepare ourselves, but prepare our people? How do we help them to prepare? How do we help them to access financing? How do we develop social programs to assist the most vulnerable? And I believe that is going to test our state of preparedness for any storms that come in the future.
Thank you very much. Mr. Jackson?
I want to comment on that as well, Deputy Governor. I actually made a note here, and this is by no means to dampen the work that Isaac and his team did. But there was a comment earlier, and Isaac also pushed back up against this a little bit. I think Jorge had said that CRIF had become the first line of defense. And Isaac said that that's not the intent for CRIF. The people, and I put a note here, the first line of defense is the community, it's the people. And if you look at one of the slides I had up where I talked about community resilience programs, and I also talked about in the resilience pathway, social protection for the poor, for the marginal and poor. It's really talking about some of these things that we need to invest in to ensure that the citizens can apply that first line of defense, but also to respond to the issues. Responding and defending starts at the level of the individual households and the community. We have to target that with our programs in the blue sky times and our programs that support them in the gray sky times. We have to look at our range of resources. CRIF can only do so much. How are we enabling the private sector to address some of the issues we're seeing in terms of even the cost of insurance? We talked about insurance penetration, household level insurance. Many people find it difficult to afford. What creative solutions can we find that allows individuals at the household level within the private markets to be able to afford insurance and to provide that other safety net? So I know we're up on lunch, but there's much more we can say about the whole investment in the communities and the range of support systems that we need to put in place. But that's an excellent point that you raise, and one we should also pick up on within the context of this very important summit.
Thank you, Mr. Jackson. And one last comment from Mr. Familiar.
No disagreement on my side. I think that the most basic line of defense is having a population that knows what to do in case of a disaster. No? And this is something that I mentioned. CRIF has become the first line of defense when it comes to the financial safety net of nations, and I think that it will keep that role in the future. But I couldn't agree more that social protection plays more and more a role. No, having good social protection programs, knowing who the vulnerable are, where they live, what are the outlets that are available to provide them with services when disaster hits. That's an essential part of maybe the most relevant aspect of recovery, which is taking care of human beings.
Thank you. And one last comment before we break for lunch from our Honorable Prime Minister, who needs a mic, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I've been listening to everyone. I'm going to stand on this side so I don't face your back. Listening to you all reconfirms that we are small island development states with so many similarities. And if I can answer in a nutshell what the questions that you have posed, Mr. Jackson, it starts with us. And our government's serious? We have to be. These storms are showing us that we cannot live in silos, and we have to cooperate with each other. We have to take responsibility for our own financial needs, so investments as well, so the things that you all have discussed here, in addition to working with entities such as the EU Commission and also World Bank, looking at various ways where the SIDS islands can benefit from certain things. CRIF. How did I hear about CRIF? And I'm the new Prime Minister on the block. OCT conference in Brussels was my first time ever hearing about CRIF. And what did I do? Considering the fact that we, St. Martin and many others, faced one of the worst storms ever that you could have never planned for, we immediately joined. I didn't know how I was going to get the money. But thank God, I must say, through the trust fund, we were able to finance it. But that was one of the things that I will urge leaders to do. Don't only come to conferences or summits just to listen. Whatever information that you take from there, take action. Because believe me, that's where it starts. And whatever else we can start discussing, for example, there's a lot of international organizations, funds go to international organizations, even that needs to be reorganized, considering climate change, considering, we have to ask the question and do a man-in-the-mirror approach as well. Are these things really effective, or can we do it better, considering that the storms are getting more, and they are inevitable. So all in all, I applaud summits like this, the input from the European Commission and that of the World Bank in helping us resolve some of our problems, but also imploring the fact that as governments, it starts with us. So we can't only be dependent on outside resources. We have to form together and try to find ways to work together. My last comment is, I was in a meeting and I heard from some countries, they were asking about the military, from the Marines that helped St. Martin during the storm. And other countries in the Caribbean are also looking to the Dutch Marines to see how they can also assist in recovery. And I'm very much, I can see everyone was really open to the idea. So we need to look at that and build upon that as well to see how we can assist. And my last thing, SEDEMA, I am coming to Barbados to see how we can be a part of that. That is also part of my mission, because we're missing out on something, in French they say grave, something essential, something important. We are missing out, and I know that our Dutch Marines are busy with SEDEMA as well. There are talks, and we want to expand on that, because together we can only be stronger.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you, PM.
Can I just...
Okay, Mr. Jackson.
Prime Minister, we welcome your leadership when you come on board. We're looking forward to it, because I sense a passion around how we can begin to change things. And we have, in fact, built on the Dutch Marines in what we call the Multinational Civil Military Coordination Cell, which is now being established at SEDEMA, which includes the Dutch, the UK military, Canadians, and the US, to pool, again, uniting to pool and support. So there are things you will learn about when you come to see us. Thanks.
And St. Martin and Regional Authorizing Officer, I hereby give you this token of appreciation for your input. Thank you. Thank you. The one that was, who was very nervous, but did a great job about planning and giving us the information from the St. Martin, well, from your perspective as the Dutch Marines here in St. Martin. I want to thank you for the information, and thank you for participating on the panel on behalf of St. Martin, of course, me being as Regional Authorizing Officer.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Raymond. Mr. Jackson, who I will see shortly, even in this session, Executive Director of SEDEMA. I want to thank you for your input as well. Thank you for participating on this panel, and the information that you've given, very impactful. I hereby give you this token of appreciation on behalf of the Organizing Committee and Regional Authorizing Officer.
Thank you.
Thank you. Prime Minister, we also given the gift bags to the panelists from the first session. So we'll thank the panelists from the second session, and we'll invite those from the first session to come forward.
Thank you, sir.
Ms. Budka-Ficeni, Mr. Pickering, Mr. Cholet,
okay.
You go.
Testing?
Yeah. Go ahead. You could
hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? No, I can't. The mic?
Yeah, go ahead.
Testing? Okay. To the director of the longest, I can say your name because I have practiced many times, and I will state. Her name is Miss Yolita Budka-Ficeni. Did I say that right? It takes practice. I want to thank you for your valuable input. Thank you for assisting with the organization as well. And on behalf of St. Martin and as Regional Authorizing Officer, I would like to give you a token of appreciation. We also have,
okay.
There's a pause. Gotcha. Okay. On behalf of the team, Mr. Thomas Cholet, thank you for your input and being here on the panel. We offer you a gift of appreciation for doing such. Thank you so much. And last but not the least, Mr. Dr. Kedrick Pickering, Minister, British Virgin Islands. You have such a sense of humor. Huh? You're a good speaker. I want to give this token of appreciation. I'm sure that this will not be the last time that we will be acquainted with each other and that you will come to St. Martin, but thank you for your participation and your valuable input in this summit. So on behalf of all of us, here is a token of appreciation.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Thank you very much to the panelists.
No,
thank you.